I want to just say, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I want to extend a special thanks to Dean Oscar, who's really doing a fantastic job here. The energy that I felt the last couple of days in this school is really remarkable, and his innovation, his willingness to sort of get out there and think about things in a different way is really very refreshing and really wonderful. You've really thrown out the red carpet, and Malak, who I've known for many years, we worked together first in New York on human rights issues in the United States, refugee issues involving the Haitians. And so we have a long history of engagement, and Malak has done such a great job and is doing such a great job coordinating this human rights and business group. I'm also thrilled that Dean Maria Jose is here and that the School of Management and Business is part of it. This is, to me, we're at a critical juncture now where we need to break down the lines between law and business, and we need to find ways for business schools, business and administration to look at human rights and other 21st century challenges to the business community, and human rights, environment, development. These are issues that affect businesses in Brazil and globally, and it's critically important that we make those links. What I'd like to do is give a little bit of background on how human rights fits in with business, and then give a couple of examples from what we're trying to do at Stern. And then finally, I want to say something about the Brazilian context and why it's so important that this initiative has started here, and why it's so important that the Brazilian business community take up the challenges that are now affecting companies not only here but around the world. When we talk about human rights, the concept of human rights as we think about it globally is really a very new concept. It dates really from the end of World War II. And when the United Nations was created, in the aftermath of the war and the Holocaust, it set up three broad objectives. If you look at the UN Charter, 1945, the UN was created to do three things, basically: to provide security, peace and security, no more world wars. So they set up the Security Council with the authority to intervene if there were threats to peace and security globally. Secondly, development. Critically important that there be economic development to prevent the kinds of insecurity that leads to war. And so the UN Development Program, World Health Organization, UNICEF, the World Bank, all of those financial pieces, part of the second objective to create development, promote development. And third, human rights. Human rights is written into the Charter, and it took 3 years, but in 1948, the states of the world, then about 65, including Brazil, created something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was an agreement among states, and it was an agreement that broke ground in two respects. It said that human rights are universal, that is to say, everybody has them by virtue of their humanity. Governments don't bestow rights. Rights exist because of you're a human being. And secondly, it internationalized the concept of rights. It said it's no longer acceptable to say state sovereignty over everything. And if a country is engaged in gross human rights violations, there's a collective responsibility of every state together to figure out what to do about that. So that's the human rights framework. But if we fast forward from 1948 to today, we're living in a different world. And the reality is, and I dealt with this when I was in the State Department, governments are powerful, but they're a lot less powerful than they were in 1948. We deal on a daily basis with issues of national security and terrorism. Al-Qaeda doesn't have a flag. They don't go to diplomatic meetings. In fact, their whole purpose is to undermine the system of states. And we spend hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars trying to figure out what to do about these non-state actors. On the positive side, we've seen an explosion of interest in a range of issues by non-governmental civil society organizations. They're doing a lot of things that governments once thought was their responsibility, but no longer have the capacity to do. It's true in China, it's true in Indonesia, it's true in the United States. When we have a natural disaster, we look to NGOs, religious groups, NGOs, on human rights and environment. And then when we look at the world today as compared to 1948, this is a world in which half of the largest economies in the world are not states, they're private companies. Half of the 100 biggest economies in the world are private companies. Walmart, Oscar mentioned Walmart, the size of Belgium or Argentina if you compare gross domestic product to revenues. Shell Oil, Exxon, $470 billion in revenues on an annual basis. These are very powerful actors, and I kept saying to Secretary Clinton when I was in the State Department, why do we have an ambassador to Benin and we don't have an ambassador to Walmart? Clearly, Walmart is a more important actor in our world today. Again, it's not to disrespect small states, but it's to say there's a different balance of power now. And so we live in a world of globalization where you have increasingly powerful global companies and increasingly weak and dysfunctional states. I call this a governance gap. And the question really is how to deal with that gap. Now, I want to say one positive, very important positive thing about globalization. We have seen in the last 30 years, and this goes to the development point, a dramatic reduction in global poverty. Over 2 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty. If you look at statistics from the World Bank, in 1980, half the world's population was living below the extreme poverty level. It's an extraordinary number. Today, it's 25% of the global population. If you look at the statistics in East Asia, in 1980, 77% of the people living in East Asia were living below the poverty level. Today, it's 14%. That's an unbelievable change. And as much as the World Bank and various development initiatives of various governments have played an important role in that, by far the driving factor is jobs. It's the private sector that has globalized the economy and created new economic opportunities. That's the good news here. Business has played and is playing on a global stage an important role in reducing global poverty. But the downside is this governance gap. And so what we see is very big companies in very poor countries where governments lack the will or the capacity, often both, to do the things they need to be doing, the duty they have to protect their own people. We've been doing a lot of work in Bangladesh, and let me give you that as an example. It's a classic example. It's a country the size of Russia in terms of population, 160 million people, living in a landmass the size of Suriname. It's a country that's 7 feet above sea level. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And so over the last 20 years, the government has encouraged the growth of a garment sector, of a manufacturing sector for low-wage, labor-intensive products, garments, clothes. Today, Bangladesh is the second largest garment-producing country in the world after China. 80% of the country's export income comes from garments. And 4 or 5 million people are working in that sector, representing 20 million people, probably, or 25 million people in terms of their families, mostly young women, and they're often the first people in their families to have a job, a real job where they get an income. So the growth of the industry has been a boon to the country. It's raised the country's income, but it's also come at a great cost. The minimum wage in Bangladesh is $60 a month, and people, these young women are working in factories that are unsafe, unstable, and dysfunctional. And so last April, almost a year ago today, middle of April of 2013, a set of factories in a place called Rana Plaza collapsed, and almost 1,200 workers, mostly young women, were killed. This is a wake-up call to the industry. And we now have two initiatives with 175 global companies from Europe, from the US, and elsewhere, who've joined in two parallel efforts to deal with the issue of factory safety. That's unprecedented in the world, but it's a reflection of the fact that H&M and Walmart and the Gap and the Spanish companies and European companies have all recognized that it's untenable, it's unsustainable to operate in a country where factories are catching fire and collapsing on a regular basis. Rana Plaza was a big example, but every week there are people dying in factories in Bangladesh because conditions are unsafe and because the government doesn't have the capacity. And so we've been working with industry, both global companies and local manufacturers and the government of Bangladesh and the World Bank and the International Labor Organization to try to get to understand what's really going on. And what's going on is that there is a sourcing model for these companies that says we're going to find the cheapest product anywhere in the world. They don't own or operate factories, and so they jump from place to place to place looking for the cheapest T-shirt. And Bangladesh is the place you find the cheapest T-shirt. It's the lowest wage in the world. And so that's what this is about. When we talk about human rights, we need to look industry by industry, place by place, and really begin to figure out what's the relationship between big companies, global companies, and weak governments. That's the essence of what we're trying to do at NYU. And it takes different forms. In Nigeria, I spend time talking to oil companies, American, European oil companies, who are operating in the Niger Delta and other places where there are conflicts going on, there are wars going on. People fight over resources, they fight over minerals. And so Shell Oil, to give one example, has a $1 billion budget every year globally to provide security to their people and their facilities. They're spending a third of that, $350 million a year on security, and by their own estimate, 25% of their product is being stolen. It's called bunkering. This is an issue for business in its own terms. How do you provide security in a way that respects human rights and at the same time is protective of your own corporate interests? We have issues of blood diamonds. We have issues of conflict minerals in the Congo. You have issues in this country where minerals are being extracted in ways that test human rights principles relating to communities, to land policy, and to security. The IT sector. We have, when I was at the State Department, we led an effort on what we called internet freedom. Secretary Clinton gave 3 major speeches. We gave lots of money to organizations trying to protect activists who were using new technologies. Well, that discussion of internet freedom and censorship is obviously part of a much bigger, more complicated discussion. It involves privacy, and I don't need to tell anyone in this room that the revelations by Mr. Snowden with respect to the NSA makes it clear that governments, the United States in particular, have enormous capacity to suck up a lot of information And the technology is ahead of policy, law, ethics. But it's not just the United States. Governments are going to gather information, and new technology makes that exercise much easier technically, but it raises human rights issues relating to privacy. So we have internet freedom, we have privacy, and we have a very lively debate about internet governance. What's it going to take to keep the internet an open platform for ideas, for commerce, for education, for innovation, for political discussion and debate? This is a human rights debate. It's about free expression, assembly, and association. How do we maintain the internet as a force for human rights in a world where all of these issues are swirling around? In the middle of that discussion are companies, including some big American companies, that are also now monetizing, making money by themselves, gathering information about us. What's the appropriate role of the private sector, private companies in the information space, whether they're internet providers or telephone companies, because it's merging with respect to privacy and human rights? Commodities. We live in a world where increasingly global companies, food, beverage companies, and others, are going off to family farms, gathering sugar, cocoa, whatever it is to make their products. But there are a range of issues as to how that supply chain works. Child labor, forced labor, issues of migrant workers and the way they're treated, issues of land. If you're in the food and beverage industry, these are issues on a daily basis you're dealing with. I could go on and on. Construction, the travel industry, you're about to have the World Cup, issues of of prostitution and trafficking, for the hotel industry, for the airline industry. What are your responsibilities? So I'm here really to say that this is a challenge for all of us. It's a challenge, and I'm really particularly delighted again that this school has stepped up. One of the things we're trying to do at NYU is to develop an academic program to deal with these issues, but also a public policy piece, to convene companies with other stakeholders, to look at these issues in an academic way, but also in a practical way. And we need and want partners, and there is no place in the world that I'd rather start the discussion than in Brazil. Why Brazil? One, you have a range of issues domestically that, again, Oscar and others here have begun to deal with, groups like Connectus. Connectus did a really interesting joint initiative with the International Commission of Jurists, produced a report several years ago called Access to Justice, Human Rights Abuses Involving Corporations in Brazil. A dozen or so different areas looked at construction, looked at labor, looked at a range of issues here. So there's a domestic debate, which is alive and important, but there's also a global piece, because increasingly Brazilian companies have a global role. In Africa and elsewhere, it's important that we look at the responsibility and the appropriate role of Brazilian companies in this governance gap. And so I will end just by saying just a word about what, and this is really, I think, a challenge to any of the business leaders in this room. We've had a discussion about these issues for 20 years. The discussion has been primarily about what a company can do, every company individually kind of making its own decisions. I think we need to take this to the next step. And by that I mean we need to be looking not just at internal processes of companies. We need to look industry by industry in what are the human rights challenges relating to the core business operations. How do businesses make their money? And what are the standards that an industry ought to create and employ that address those challenges? Like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these standards can't be imposed by others. They have to include the business community in shaping those standards and the metrics, the benchmarks that evaluate whether or not they're complying. We need to help those companies find ways to implement the standards, and we need to find tools to evaluate whether that's happening. Consumers need information to make informed purchasing decisions, and investors need to understand and need to be helpful here in going and looking in the longer term at what business sustainability is all about. So that's the challenge to me, moving from the ad hoc or from the public relations corporate social responsibility approach. This is not about charity. It's not about doing nice things in the community. It's about how do you make your money? And that's the challenge for Brazilian companies and companies around the world, to be honest about the challenges you face, but at the same time, it's a challenge for the rest of us to recognize the business reality. Companies are in business to make money, so we've got to find a way for businesses to embrace this agenda of sustainability in a way that's consistent with their business models. Not an easy task, but this is the moment for us to be working on these issues. And again, we welcome the initiatives here and the chance to work with our partners in Brazil. Thank you.
Acho que nós poderíamos ter uma rodada de perguntas para o professor Posner. Então, tivermos Bruno, professor Bruno.
Good morning, Professor Posner. I'm a professor here. We met each other.
Yes.
We met yesterday, and I'm here to learn. And thank you for your very informative presentation. I think it's clear that when you talk about a governance gap, it evidently does make sense and should, drive all of us towards a direction where we find room for the kinds of initiatives that you champion, you and Oscar are championing. And also, when you talk about the fact that this is not about charity, and therefore you're reminding us that the business of businesses is business. That is also a sensible point, and evidently there is a tension between the two standpoints, while both of them individually does make sense. So in trying to put the two of them together, I want to make sure that I get, what is in practice here at stake, and the way I see it. I want to. I would like you to tell me that I'm missing on something. The way I see it is as follows. So if a business will endeavor more efforts and energy and time into protecting human rights, that entails a cost. So this is costly. There's no escape to that. Either because you're paying more, higher salaries, or you're not spying your competitors, or whatever it is, providing better health or taking care of the native communities. That is always a cost. So how could this be set as business still? And I believe that there's two ways, and I only see two ways. First one is that you're as a matter of fact doing PR. So instead of investing in, for example, sponsoring a soccer team or a volleyball team, or hiring beautiful people to be on TV smiling, you're doing something more useful from a social standpoint. So that should be a very welcome move from companies. Again, spending money with PR with other than BS, So that's a good thing. We should welcome that. It's a wonderful idea. The other one is less good, and that is creating barriers of entry. So, you know, you raise the barrier for somebody to join a certain industry, and just because you're Walmart or General Motors or Odebrecht or Camargo Correa or whatever the hell you are, that, you know, just makes it affordable for you, but not to your smaller competitors. And that is the downside of the sorts of initiatives you're championing. So my question is, am I missing on something? Because I don't see other ways in which this makes sense other than these two ones. And if I'm not missing on something, do you agree that there is a positive side and a downside for the kinds of initiatives that we are sort of embarking on?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you are missing something. We need to move beyond the notion of corporate governance and corporate culture that says, driven by institutional investors who look very short-term at profit and loss, and begin to think about what does sustainability really mean to a global company. And so there are companies now who are making decisions that I think are not in their business interests, but in the short term, they feel that's the only thing they can do. Let me give you an example. I traveled to China when I was in the government, and at the I went to the Foxconn factory in Shenzhen. This is a factory producing Apple computers. There's been a lot of public attention because a number of people have committed suicide. Workers have jumped off buildings. And I was there 8 hours. And I met with the head of the company, a whole range of senior leaders. And one of the things I learned was that because the company has a range of problems in terms of worker satisfaction, worker participation, and the like, they have a turnover every month of 15%. So I spent a lot of time looking at the training programs they set up. Why do they set up training programs? Because, by the way, I should say, this is a factory with 240,000 people. Foxconn is the largest private employer in China. They produce half of all these electronic gadgets we carry around in our pockets and have in front of us all day. 15% is the industry average there. And so they spend an enormous amount of time recruiting, training, doing all these things that are a reflection of the fact that they are not a sustainable workplace. There's a cost to that, but they can see their way, because to do it differently would involve an investment, as you say. It's not cost-free, but it's a different way of doing business. I'll give you another example. I worked with Nike, which was sort of the poster child for bad behavior in the manufacturing space in the 90s. There was a big public campaign because Nike was not treating its workers well. The first reaction of the company was a typical reaction, which was major public relations and to kind of find the lawyers to tell them avoid all the legal risks. And the publicity continued. And at a certain point, the CEO, the chief executive, Phil Knight, made a judgment. This is affecting our stock price. We've got to think about how to do this differently. And so they went from 3,500 factories producing their garments to 800 in 30 countries. They made a judgment that they're going to have a supply chain that is consistent and reliable over time. It cost them money to do that because they weren't always going for the cheapest thing. But they wound up, and they're in a place today where every year And every 5 years, they're basically dealing with the same factories. They put money into training, they're paying a competitive wage, but at the high end, and they have a much better, if you talk to Nike executives, they have better quality product, they have better workforce retention again, they have, and if you notice, they're making a lot of money. Now, again, every company can't do that. Every company's got a different, it's a hard, I'd have a harder time making that case for Walmart because their business model is so much the lowest price always. But it's interesting. I can give you many more examples where companies have said, let's take a longer-term view and begin to think about doing business a different way that meets our bottom line and at the same time addresses these issues. So I think it's a long-term, short-term issue, and it's got to be company by company. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Professor Posner, I'm Jed Kroenke. I'm also a professor here at Direitos GV. So just so that I understand how you're conceptualizing your project, is that you want to help create self-regulatory regimes for companies to implement, and then you envision some other academic or institutional third party that's going to provide objective evaluations of how these self-regulatory regimes are going to operate, and then you're going to attempt to disseminate that both through various metrics to investors and consumers, right? So the sort of the feedback loop is to both create objectively like these regimes for companies to implement to help educate them about these potential long-term, short-term interactions, and then provide market information for other actors to enforce this through market mechanisms. Okay? So one, I just want to make sure that that's sort of how you envision this sort of like global project and what would be the type of regimes, even in the academic program at Stern, that you're trying to educate future leaders about. Second, in this governance gap question then, if we look at a country like Bangladesh, right, where there is a power asymmetry between the state and these global international companies, and then we look at some place like Brazil where the power asymmetry is not necessarily the same. So I was wondering, this particular model that you're envisioning, do you really see this as applying in the same way to Brazil, where the state has a great deal of power, both directly state-owned enterprises, right? The number of countries where major economic actors are actually directly linked to the state, or maybe a political regulatory objective is still much more likely. So for example, in the cited China and Foxconn, a lot of the increases in wages and sort of the changes in internal Foxconn procedures have been forced upon them by both the provincial Shenzhen government and national interests, right? So there's been in part a political push as much as there's been these attempts to use market information about labor practices at Foxconn as a way of enforcing these types of changes. So yeah, so just to get clarity about this, the structure of the model and whether or not this is something that is maybe more appropriate for Bangladesh, but not so appropriate for countries like China and Brazil, where the governance gap isn't articulated in the same type of way.
Those are good questions. On the first question, I had to be clear, and I should have been clear in what I said. I long to live in a world where there are 193 governments that respect human rights and protect their own people. I don't happen to live in that world, but I want to get there, and that ought to be the primary focus. It's not going to happen in any of our lifetimes. And countries are along a spectrum. You know, Bangladesh or Sierra Leone or Somalia are at one end of the spectrum, and, I don't know, Sweden or somebody else is at the other end. But we have to accept the fact that while we're on this journey from where we are today to 193 democratic, rights-respecting, protective governments, there's got to be some ways in which we navigate the difference, the gap. That's the discussion. So I think the primary focus on you build legal institutions, you build capacity in the civil society sector, you build consumer awareness, you do all these things that build sustainable democracy. That's primary one. But at the same time, we have to recognize that states aren't there. And that takes me to your second question, really, of, and so what we do in the interim, what I'm suggesting is there need to be ways that companies this is all about rules of the road. What do you do in this kind of messy space where a very big part of the economy is global companies coming in with a lot of influence, a lot of leverage and power in places where the governments are weak? What are the rules? We don't know the rules. And companies, I think, rightly are saying, we don't really know what to do. So what I'm suggesting is we need to look industry by industry. It's very different if you're in the IT sector than if you're in the mining sector, and figure out, again, what's your core business? How do you develop standards across the industry? And the companies need to be part of that, but it needs to be a multi-stakeholder discussion. Civil society needs a place. Government ideally ought to have a place, but there needs to be a discussion among different actors that have a stake in it. And then, I mean, I can give you some examples. There are in almost every one of the industries I described, some now more formal multi-stakeholder organizations that bring together companies, NGOs, in some cases governments, voluntary principles on security and human rights in the extractives, the Fair Labor Association in manufacturing, Global Network Initiative for the IT sector, where companies have agreed to come in collectively and be part of this discussion about standards, metrics, implementation, and evaluation. But it's an interim measure. It's an interim measure while we get to nirvana, where all the governments actually do their job. But if I can just have one last thought on your last point. I think Brazil is a very interesting case because, as you say, it's not Bangladesh, but it's also not Sweden. And so there are lots of opportunities here, both by the private sector, by academic institutions, and the government, to be thinking about where the gaps are here. It's not Bangladesh. It's a very strong democratic country, but a democratic country with some real challenges. And so it is in some ways a model or a kind of ideal place to be looking at a national response. And at the same time, as I said, there are global companies based in Brazil that also have a global responsibility. When a Brazilian company goes to Mozambique, it's in the same position as a European company going to Bangladesh. It's got to think about this question of governance gap and what its responsibilities are as a big company.
Just a footnote on Jed's question. If you think it is proper to draw a parallel between what is happening in the field of corruption and what probably will be happening in the field of human rights, in the sense that in the last decade or so, U.S. started with a very strong legislation creating responsibilities for its companies abroad. Right. Europe also adopted a model. Our professor Maíra is an expert on this issue and taught me about that. And many other countries are adopting this. So corruption became not just a responsibility of the states, but also responsibilities of the companies themselves to take care and create mechanisms, and not only in their own jurisdictions, but also abroad. So there is this transfer of responsibility for the new powerful player in town. And my question is very objective. Do you have information of efforts in the same direction, or like I'm asking now the former assistant secretary, do you have the U.S. is talking about this, or no? This is far away.
Yeah, no, there's definitely conversation about it. I would say my own experience in the U.S. government is that there was deep division within the government. We had a range of agencies, Commerce Department and Treasury and the Trade Representative, who were largely, almost exclusively, I would say, focused on promoting U.S. exports. That was their vision of what the government's role was, or public-private partnerships where you'd get a private company to pay for something the government couldn't afford. The issue of how to regulate or restrict in any way U.S.-based companies is just beginning to be discussed. And it's come up primarily in two contexts, two country-specific contexts. One is, after the financial crisis in the U.S., Congress passed a law called Dodd-Frank, and the Dodd-Frank law had in it a requirement, a reporting requirement, for any U.S.-based company finding minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo, conflict minerals. A lot of things, for example, that go into phones are minerals that are found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there are all kinds of human rights violations in that process. It is now a federal law or federal regulation that any company doing business there has got to report on what they're doing and how they're addressing the human rights issue. It doesn't go as far as corrupt practices, but I can assure you the companies are very nervous about going to the Security and Exchange Commission in a public filing and saying what they're doing, because there are consequences if they don't get it right. The second was Burma, Myanmar, whereas we lifted sanctions, we imposed, and this I was very closely involved in, a reporting requirement for any U.S. business doing more than $500,000 has got to say, again, in a public report to the government, here's what we've invested in, with whom, and these are the human rights consequences, and here's what we're doing to address the human rights problem. Again, companies are very nervous about public reporting in these situations because they know that there are things that they are up against that are, again, going to cost them time, money, and energy. So and the European Union is now looking at similar human rights reporting requirements more broadly, but that's still in process. But I think that's the direction we're going.
Hi, Professor Posner. Thank you very much for your talk. It seems that the business and human rights discussion nowadays, it's based on this tripod that you have to have strong state regulation, and companies, private enterprises, they ought to build strong due diligence mechanisms. And then civil society should act as monitor and oversight these the initiatives by state and by private actors. What do we do when this division, especially between state and private actors, it's blurred, like in Brazil? I'd give you an example, for instance, in the case of Belo Monte. First, just to say that in Brazil, the big violations of human rights, they're usually in the context of big projects, especially these infrastructure projects in the Amazon. So what do we do when the state acts as financier through its development bank? The state acts as an entrepreneur because the consortium is half a state-owned company, and the state is also the supervisor with these agencies like the indigenous agency, the environmental agency. So for me, there's a clear conflict of interest going on there. And how can you apply the business and human rights standards like the UN guiding principles to these cases where there is not a clear line, or which is the entrepreneur, where is the state? And the state is actually sometimes being a sponsor to the interests of the private actors within the judiciary, for instance, when these the actions get judicialized. So how do you act in this context of Brazil and other countries?
Well, again, I know only the broad outlines of Belmonte, but I understand major construction projects here raise a range of issues, as you say, with indigenous communities, land issues, labor issues, etc. And I think the answer is not for civil society to stand quietly, but to get engaged. And what I would say is, again, I don't know if there's anybody here from the construction industry, but part of what the engagement I'd like to see is more direct effort to engage the industry leaders themselves, to publicize the things that are going on that are wrong, but at the same time to try to get the leaders themselves to say, okay, we've got a problem here across the board, and what are some of the ways that we can be dealing with it in a more intelligent way? If the state's not enforcing, or the state is, as you're suggesting, even a partner in some of that, then I think you have to say there's a gap, there's a problem. And there needs to be a way to engage. I should say, my view is that we've tried for a long time in the U.S. and elsewhere to view this as, we viewed companies almost as a target in the way that we viewed bad governments. And we've had a kind of culture of condemnation and, we're going to expose bad behavior and it's going to go away. Or we're going to sue them and it's going to go away. It hadn't worked. It hasn't worked in most instances. That isn't to say you never try. There's some extreme cases where it's important to push. But it's also true that the much of the discussion about business and human rights within business has been, let's avoid the problem. Let's do corporate social responsibility, charity. So the problem's over here in our operations, and we're gonna build a park somewhere, or give some charity. That's also not an answer. So what I'm in favor of is a high standard, but with companies involved. And I think the challenge for civil society here or anywhere is to figure out smart ways to engage companies directly, to really get inside the operations and try to figure out what are the challenges, what are the costs, and how do you get industry competitors to say, here in Belmonte, you've got a bunch of companies working. How do you get some common agreement on some minimum standards? That's to me what's going to make a difference. It's not going to be easy. And I'm sure some of the companies don't want to be part of the discussion. But you start with one or two that are leaders, and you bring them on, and you say, this is now what we're doing. And I've seen this again in different industries. One or two corporate leaders can set a tone, and they begin to open up the space. And as they get more engaged in the merits, they realize we've got a problem. Companies would rather not think about these things because they're complicated. Our job, I think, is to create a space where companies begin to think about it.
Professor, my name is Anna. I work for Childhood. We are an independent organization promoting the protection of children against abuse and exploitation. And we work with different sectors. You mentioned tourism, construction, and transportation. We work with truck drivers, workers from the construction companies. And I would like to say that still we are in a stage. You mentioned that it's not a charity issue. I understand this as a vision, what we want, but we are in a state that we need to deal with corporate social responsibility areas. We need to work with people that are under sustainability areas, because this vision is not integrated yet on their business models. So I would like you to comment that what's the possibility we have in the stage we are. So we are, as an independent organization, we believe that since we are all part of the problem, we have to be together finding the solution. That's why we try to engage companies. That's why we try to engage governments. But it's hard for us that we have the same vision, but at the same time, we need to engage people that are already doing things on a charity level, sometimes on a corporate social responsibility level, sometimes. So,
I'm glad you asked that, because I want to be clear about what I'm saying. I totally respect, admire, praise companies who are engaged in charity. And corporate social responsibility is taught at our business school in the marketing department. And so I understand that there's a public relations piece, but there's also a real piece. I was part of something called the UN Global Compact in its early stage. And companies would come in, many companies, and the only requirement is that they had a report on something they were doing. And I swear maybe 80 or 100 companies came in and they said, we're building an AIDS clinic in Soweto. And I thought to myself, how many AIDS clinics can there be in Soweto? But the fact is, those are good things. I think we should give companies absolute credit for being engaged in charity, for being engaged in community. We had to give them credit for the role they played in bringing people out of global poverty. Companies have played a very positive role. So I'm pro-company, but there's a separate discussion. And what I would say is encourage and engage in the things that they're doing, and then somewhere in the conversation say, oh, by the way, I'm also interested in your core business. I'm interested in the operation.
I agree.
And here's some of the things that we need to be talking about with you. So it's not a hostile conversation, but it's a direct conversation. We've got to move this out of the side office to the center. Yeah. It's what the CEO is doing. It's what the operations people are doing. Again, it's how they make their money.
This is what we have been trying, but I just wanted to mention that it's step by step, at least in our experience here. Totally. It takes a lot of time, and we have to start in an area, and sometimes it's only the corporate social responsibility people that want to listen to us.
Yeah,
this is our reality here. So
you can empower them also by being tougher in your discussions with the government, with the company. Because often my experience is I talk to a lot of CSR people in companies, and they're the most frustrated bunch of people because they're sitting there, they know that they're supposed to be dealing with things, but they're nowhere near the decisions.
Tem uma pergunta aqui, mais uma ali. Alguém tem outra depois? Ou... Tem?
Michael?
Yes.
Yes.
Well,
I'm very interested as coordinator of the group on business and human rights to know what your experience was on the multiple stakeholder meeting that you had in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why this is so important for us. As a group, we worked with another center at GV called the Center for Sustainability, and with a number of companies. And we've learned a lot from this. We worked on protection of children. And I would like to know, what did you get out of this experience? To put people together in a room for 2 days, as you told us.
right.
Is there any report that came out of it? Is there anything that we can duplicate in our work? That would be very interesting.
Yeah. So again, we organized a meeting last September. We had about 60 people there, half of them from Bangladesh. Some large manufacturers, the government, NGOs. We had some very big American, European brands, very big. And we had 7 or 8 governments, mostly Western governments. We had the ILO, we had the IFC. And we locked the doors for 2 days and said, this is completely off the record. And we had no speeches, no panels. We really just asked what's going on here and what are you doing about it. A couple of things that came out of that were really interesting. One is that these big manufacturers in Bangladesh, some of them very big and quite successful, had never been in a room with a company like the Gap or Walmart. They'd never been in a room with them. Everything is done through sourcing agents or purchasing agents who are somewhere else, based in Delhi or based in Hong Kong. And so it's all transactional. And the discussion of how it works never is discussed. The discussion of what the model is for sourcing, never discussed. And the discussions got quite heated, actually. And it was very revealing of how disconnected the two worlds are. That's first lesson. And the perceptions from Bangladesh, from the business sector, totally different from the Western brands. And it was revealing to me how many of the Western brands came out and said, we had no idea. Some of the things, some of the unintended consequences of what we're doing. Purchasing practices. You change the order. You change the day. And all of a sudden they're working 7 days a week. It doesn't affect the bottom line. It's just, the brands have all the power and all the influence. They make the decisions. The second thing is that we learned a lot about subcontracting. And this is the big secret, one of the big secrets in Bangladesh. Those 175 Western companies that have come together have said, we're responsible for 1,900 factories in Bangladesh. Those are the factories where they have a contractual relationship. And when the local manufacturers said, oh, we use subcontractors all the time, there's no way we can fill your order without using subcontractors, they said, oh, no, we have a rule against subcontractors. And the Bangladeshis started laughing. And they said, are you kidding? How do you think this gets done? Well, it turns out there's 6,000 or 6,500 factories in Bangladesh producing for export. So there's 4,000 factories that they don't take any responsibility for. And so that's where those are the factories that are falling down. Those are the factories that are catching fire. And so we are doing a report in the next few weeks. We're following up with a meeting in Dhaka in Bangladesh at the end of this month. And we're going to basically work with a local business school there and some local leaders, business leaders and others, to try to figure out how to address these problems in an ongoing basis. Because the effort of these two big global initiatives only deal with a piece of the problem, not the essential element, which is the broad number of unauthorized subcontracting factories. But it's really interesting. It was a very revealing meeting, and it's that process, and again, I think you guys can do it here, of bringing businesses in to a conversation where they're not so uncomfortable that they show up, but that they're sufficiently uncomfortable while they're there that they realize that there's some problems they need to deal with. It was constructive, it was honest, it was respectful, but it was very much getting to the real issues.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your very interesting speech. My name is Stina Nilsson. I work for an owner advocate within Responsible Investments, a Swedish company, but I'm based here in Sao Paulo. My question is about, because I definitely agree that, it needs to be within a company's business model to take responsibility. So my question is about the incentives for companies really to, to really incorporate this. Basically, what do you see are the main incentives? I guess that could also differ a lot depending on sector, of course, but if you could say anything in general. And also what we who are here in this room, how we can best encourage companies to, to really bring sustainability issues into their core business.
So, again, that's a good question, and it follows up on the question earlier about why do companies do this. There are negative incentives and there are positive incentives. The negative incentive is risk to reputation. It's often the case that companies get religion on this when they're in the middle of a public crisis. It's not an accident that Nike, the campaign against Nike led them to change their business practice, or Apple, or Killer Coke. I mean, I give you a lot of examples. The cost, most companies don't recognize the cost of getting into one of these public disputes. It's risk to reputation, but it's also real costs in terms of hours spent, litigation costs if there's a lawsuit. There are a range of things that are real. Now, most companies think, okay, it's not going to be me, and so they keep their head down. But you know, we live in a globalized world that's also a world where information is so much easier to get and to disseminate. And so one thing I say to companies is, you know, again, this is not the world of not only 1950, it's not the world of 2000. Everybody's got a cell phone, every phone's got a camera, everything's up on the net in hours, minutes, and all you need is one incident in your factory, or one incident on your farm, or one incident in the mine, and there's a public thing that you have no control of. You don't want to be in that position. So that's the negative incentive. Be prepared, be proactive, and do the right thing ahead of time so that when the crisis occurs, if it does, you have something to say. The positive is that good companies, sustainable companies, are also companies where people feel better to go to work, where it's easier to recruit good people, where you have greater efficiency, you have greater reliability of product or operation. These things go together. Again, Oscar talked about corruption. You tend to find where there's a problem, there's multiple problems. Companies where there's inefficiency, where there's corruption, where there's human rights violations, tend to have problems across the board, and they don't do as well. So I think the notion here of a sustainable company that's looking at environment, that's looking at human rights, that's looking at integrity and corruption, those are the companies over the long term that are going to succeed. Now, we need to persuade the investment community to take their foot off the pedal and say, this is actually in the best interest of a company. We got to give them a little time to get there. We're not there yet. And I think consumers can help as well. We've got to bring, I think consumers, there are many, many consumers who would make the right choice if they had the right information. So I think that's part of where we're going here, to find ways to give consumers comparative information of who's doing what. Companies, again, are nervous about that, but we're seeing more and more efforts to do that, and I think that's part of the future.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Lamento não tenho ainda a fluência em inglês que eu gostaria. Por essa razão, me desculpo por falar em português, parabenizando o professor pela sua fala e sensibilidade. Meu nome é Dalila, eu represento a Associação Brasileira de Defesa da Mulher, da Infância e da Juventude e sou membro do Comitê Nacional de Enfrentamento ao Tráfico de Pessoas. Nos últimos anos, eu tenho acompanhado a situação lamentável que eu observo no entorno das grandes obras, como hidrelétricas de Jirau, Santo Antônio e Belo Monte. Do ponto de vista da situação de vulnerabilidade a que ficaram expostas as comunidades ribeirinhas, tradicionais, indígenas, quando o que observamos é que o mercado do sexo chega antes do canteiro de obras. Mais recentemente, acompanhando a construção de um grande estádio ainda no estado de São Paulo, observamos não só a exploração do trabalho, da mão de obra escrava, o deslocamento de trabalhadores que se encontravam em condição análoga à escravidão, como também a exploração sexual de crianças no entorno dessas grandes obras. Observando a fala de um cacique em Altamira, em Belo Monte, sobre o que pensam os indígenas das propostas de compensação, o que nós observamos e compreendemos é que não existe compensação para o que está acontecendo no Brasil. E é lamentável que nós, que somos do movimento de defesa, que acreditamos na defesa da dignidade da pessoa humana, no direito que crianças e adolescentes têm ao desenvolvimento sexual saudável e protegido, no direito que as comunidades indígenas têm de garantir sua vivência, sua tradição. Esse deslocamento é irreversível do ponto de vista de como essas pessoas passarão a viver. Nesse sentido, na última semana, o Núcleo Estadual de Enfrentamento ao Tráfico de Pessoas organizou um evento com a Faculdade de Arquitetura e Urbanismo para perguntar o que esses profissionais têm a ver com essa situação de escravidão, de exploração de mão de obra, de exploração sexual. Eu achei muito importante porque você chama toda a sociedade para o debate. Então, a palavra que não quer calar, a expressão, na verdade, que não se cala é como garantir o desenvolvimento sem que se tenha tantos desvios, tantas atrocidades praticadas contra a pessoa humana num país que hoje é reconhecido como emergente, que é o Brasil. Muito obrigada.
First of all, it should be, I should be apologizing to all of you for not speaking Portuguese. So I notice I'm the only one with one of these things on. The issues you raise are among the hardest issues, and ultimately, when we talk about human rights, it's always the case that the primary victims are the most vulnerable people in society. It's whether we're looking at refugees or internal conflict or whatever. It's women, it's children, it's indigenous populations, it's racial minorities. That's the case here, and it's the case virtually in every society. And so what you're doing is extremely important. It's hard. And I think the one thing I would say is, and this is something I'm very conscious of, especially on issues of, sexual exploitation, treatment of women, we will benefit when more women are running companies. We'll benefit when more women are deans of business schools. I'm delighted to see Maria Jose here. I actually am sort of having an internal debate in my own school because when I came, I was a bit shocked at how few women there were in the finance department. We have one tenured finance professor who's a woman. And when I asked people how could that be, they said, well, we can't find qualified people. I said, that's ridiculous. They said there's only 5 women that are even eligible for this position. I said there are 160 million women in the United States. There must be 6 women and one that would come to Stern. I went and looked at how many women deans there were. And it turned out that I actually did a little internet research. I was really agitated about this because it just seemed ridiculous. And so I looked at the top 10 business schools in the United States. And over 100 years, many of them are now 90, 100 years old, I added up 140 deans. And of those 140 deans, this is Harvard and Wharton and Stanford and Columbia and NYU, 2 were women. 2. And so how do we lead business on issues of gender and equality and discrimination if business schools themselves aren't playing a role? So, you're doing more here than we're doing in the States on this, and it's inexcusable to me. But I think as more women take leadership roles in companies, they're going to be more sensitive to the issues you're raising. That's not the answer. We can't wait for that to happen with these construction companies. But again, I applaud what you're doing. It's really an important agenda, and it's a critical human rights piece. It comes up in all kinds of contexts.
Okay, I think we have the last question.
Professor, my name is Luis. I'm a student at Fundação Getúlio Vargas. And the way I see, actually, first of all, I would like to thank you for this very interesting and this great opportunity. And I would like to ask you about the role that the law plays in this debate. Because the way I see is that you mentioned it's important that some CEOs buy this initiative and start this movement, and the others will follow. Or you mentioned the reputational cost of doing something that is contrary to human rights. However, these are all business or economical movements in my point of view. And I would like to know if the law is only an spectator in that sense, defining what human rights are, or if it can play a leadership role, so to speak, and influence the decisions and the implementation of this project. Thank you.
Let me answer that in two ways. One is that I think with respect to corporate practices in Brazil, the law can and should play a really important role. It's critical that the laws be strong, but it's as or more important that the laws be enforced. And lawyers and the legal community have a role in making sure that that happens. It's a different discussion when you talk about a Brazilian company doing business in Mozambique, because there I think the law has a harder time figuring out what's the jurisdiction, what's the remedy, how do you actually enforce an international standard. But the second thing I would say is that I think the legal community and private law firms in particular have a much greater role than they've exercised here or elsewhere. I know especially in my country. Lawyers tend to be risk averse, and they tend to want to do what will please their clients. And so they're often giving advice to keep your head down, to follow the letter of what you absolutely have to do rather than what you should do. A good lawyer provides counsel, guidance, practical advice. A lawyer needs to go beyond the risk-averse, here's what you absolutely have to do. And I think it's incumbent on the leaders of the legal profession to begin thinking about the responsibility of the legal community to lead rather than to defend their clients' narrowly defined interests. I think you can be a good lawyer, protect your client, but at the same time help them get to the right place.
I was wrong. There's another last answer, last question or not?
Last question.
Okay.
Good morning. My name is Amon. I'm a professor at the business school here. I would like to thank you for sharing your ideas. And I would like you to talk a little bit more about the role you see the university playing in this, like mediating the relations between civil society and business, but also being part of civil society. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a good question to end on. I think there are at least 3 different roles a business school can play, and we're trying to do this at NYU. One is to teach and to engage students in these issues as a serious discipline. Most business schools, in fact, very few business schools, have any teaching on human rights. What are human rights, and how do they apply to business? It's a subject, and business leaders ought to come out of business schools, young business students ought to come out understanding what this is about. And so we're teaching a whole range of courses on this subject, and we're finding that a lot of faculty in our school say, you know, I don't really know about human rights, but I think it might have something to do with management or finance or whatever it is they're teaching. So I think one is teaching. Second is scholarship. There's a lot of room to study these issues from a business perspective. Again, a business-oriented perspective. What are the challenges? How do smart businesses deal with these issues? How do you develop the metrics? How do you implement them in a way that works with the business model? So second is research. And the third is this notion of convening, as we did with the Bangladesh context. I think a business school is a safer forum or platform. Bring business leaders in with others to have the conversations that aren't going on. And out of that comes a potential for public education and advocacy. but view the business school as a resource to the community, to the society, to the country, as a way to be a place where these discussions happen in a way that businesses feel that they have a seat at the table, they can be open and honest, and you can then make practical recommendations to them, and even help them in direct ways.
Okay. Bom, todos os que me conhecem sabem que eu tenho uma dificuldade de não falar, né? E o Michael, em alguma medida, ao responder a pergunta do Aron, falou sobre os desafios para uma business school, de incluir esse temário dentro da sua agenda, né? Mas eu entendo que, se não é igualmente difícil fazer dentro de uma faculdade de Direito, é mais difícil. Essa, pelo menos, é a minha percepção. E aí eu volto à análise que ele fez sobre o papel do advogado dentro das corporações, seja os in-house lawyers, né, ou os advogados das grandes firmas que dão consultoria para as grandes empresas. No espaço de tempo que nós temos interagido com grandes empresas no Brasil, é fascinante como o pessoal da área de responsabilidade social está muito entusiasmado de ter o diálogo sobre direitos humanos, muito frustrado com a velocidade com que a empresa é capaz de responder essas demandas. O setor de marketing, absolutamente preocupado com esse problema, especialmente se nós estamos falando de empresa que tem um contato direto com o consumidor, né? Eu sempre brinco que ninguém quer ter a propaganda, né? Você abre uma geladeira e vê uma criança escrava dentro da geladeira, né? Porque isso afeta. É evidente que no setor de empresas que não está exposto diretamente ao público, a relação é um pouco distinta, né? Então, você tem o setor de responsabilidade social, você tem o setor de marketing, que são setores muito sensíveis, né? Nesses anos, também, um pouco do que eu pude perceber, eu acho que ontem o Michael e eu falamos sobre isso, e é surpreendente, que é o setor operacional, tá? É muito interessante você sentar com um engenheiro que está na Amazônia há 20 anos, né? Eu lembro de um desses engenheiros que, falando sobre prostituição, quando a obra chega, né, você já tem um canteiro de prostituição antecipada. Esse é a maior, vamos dizer, o mercado mais eficiente que eu já vi funcionando no planeta. Quer dizer, ele se antecipa e com uma enorme flexibilidade. E aí as prostitutas tinham um número maior do que a própria comunidade onde aquela obra estava se inserindo, né? E quando elas chegaram, evidentemente que os membros daquela comunidade fizeram um abaixo-assinado, porque chegada de 400 prostitutas numa pequena vila causa alguma dificuldade, né? E então o engenheiro foi negociar com as prostitutas, e elas automaticamente fizeram um abaixo-assinado que, além das 400 assinaturas delas próprias, tinha dos 4.000 funcionários da obra, e, portanto, o abaixo-assinado de 200 pessoas feita pelo vereador foi derrubado por um abaixo-assinado com mais de 4.000 assinaturas liderados pelas prostitutas. Então, veja, quando você vai a campo, você encontra pessoas absolutamente sensíveis aos problemas, porque eles enfrentam esses problemas no dia a dia, né? Conversando até com o pessoal de finanças, né? Poxa, vocês estão aqui com uma política de direitos humanos, mas me mandam reduzir 10% desse projeto. E quando eu vou reduzir o projeto, vocês me encaminham para reduzir exatamente em tudo aquilo que eu poderia fazer para prevenir violações de direitos humanos. Então, é muito interessante. A área que, na minha pouca experiência, é a mais resistente é a área jurídica, né? Exatamente pelos motivos que o Michael falou. Por quê? Porque eles têm uma noção de construir um argumento sobre aquilo que é o mínimo necessário para que você não corra um risco judicial, tá? E, evidentemente, que aí você separa e fala, não faça isso. E, melhor ainda, não verbalize que você quer ter essa responsabilidade, porque isso pode se voltar contra você, né? Então, a comunidade de advogados é um setor muito sensível que eu acho que nós temos que trabalhar. E, evidentemente, que esses advogados não estão lá por um defeito atávico de moralidade, é porque nós formamos mal. As faculdades de direito formam mal o advogado, elas não conseguem transferir, né? Evidente que há exceções, por exemplo, tem um grupo de advogadas líderes de escritórios in-house, de indústria de tecnologia no Brasil, fantásticas. Tudo que você quer, você fala com elas, já fizeram, já pensaram, tem uma maior quantidade de pro bono feito. Então, você tem mecanismos aí para lidar, mas realmente eu acho que a nossa responsabilidade, aqui na escola, eu fiquei muito contente que eu tinha vários colegas aqui hoje que não são da área, né? Então, porque é uma área a ser construída em todas as áreas. O pessoal aqui de direito penal, de direito de desenvolvimento, de corporate law, essas pessoas têm que se engajar. A turma de Direitos Humanos, né, nós esperamos que eles estejam aqui. Né? Eu estou vendo a Marina, estou vendo a Júlia, a Flávia, isso é natural. Mas eu acho que nós temos que ter um engajamento, e não é um engajamento simples, né? Porque não é simplesmente por uma aversão, é porque é difícil pensar como é que eu encaixo isso dentro da minha área. Mas esse é o desafio que eu acho que nós temos que fazer. Então, eu peço desculpas por ter falado, agradeço imensamente a generosidade, a inteligência e a disposição do professor Posner para discutir conosco. Eu acho que esse é um primeiro passo numa discussão mais longa. Mais uma vez, a minha querida Maria José, por estar nesta empreitada junto conosco.